I'm a 16-year-old girl, and this happened last fall when my friends and I decided to throw a bonfire at my friend Jake's place. It was one of those crisp autumn nights where the air is cool and the smell of leaves fills the air. We'd all gathered at Jake's house because his family owned a huge piece of land with a perfect spot for a bonfire, right in the middle of a clearing surrounded by woods. There were about 10 of us that night, all of us juniors in high school. We'd brought marshmallows, hot dogs, and enough snacks to last the whole night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit the fire, and soon the flames were crackling and casting long shadows across the clearing. It was the perfect night for a bonfire. After a while, someone suggested we play sardines, a game we all knew well. For those who don't know, sardines is like hide and seek, but in reverse. One person hides, and everyone else tries to find them. When you find the person, you hide with them until the last person finds the group, cramped together like sardines. Jake volunteered to hide first, and we all counted down while he ran off into the woods. The rest of us huddled around the fire, laughing and joking as we waited. After a few minutes, we split up to start searching for him. The woods were dark, even with the light of the bonfire behind us. The trees were thick, and the moonlight barely filtered through the branches. I was with my friend Emily, and we decided to stick together as we moved further away from the fire. We called out Jake's name a few times, but there was no answer. That wasn't surprising. Jake was always good at this game, and he knew how to stay hidden. We pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of the bonfire growing fainter behind us. After about 15 minutes of searching, Emily and I hadn't found anything. We were starting to get frustrated when we heard a rustling sound to our left. We both froze, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then we heard a voice. "Guys, over here!" It was Jake. We followed the sound of his voice, pushing through some thick underbrush until we found a small clearing. Jake was there, crouched down behind a fallen tree. He grinned when he saw us. "Took you long enough," he whispered, motioning for us to join him. We laughed and squeezed in next to him, our backs against the rough bark. "Where are the others?" I asked. "No idea," Jake replied, keeping his voice low. "But this is a good spot. They won't find us for a while." We sat there in silence, listening to the sounds of the woods. The game was still fun, but there was something unsettling about being out here, in the dark, away from the warmth of the fire. After a few minutes, we heard footsteps approaching. We all tensed up, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves. They stopped just outside the clearing. We held our breath, waiting for one of our friends to find us. But instead of a familiar voice calling out, we saw him. An older man, his face lined with age, his clothes dirty and worn. He was standing just a few feet away from us, staring with a strange intensity. Emily's hand tightened around mine, and I could feel her trembling. We exchanged a nervous glance, but none of us moved. The man didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on us, like he was studying us. Jake whispered, "Who is that?" I shook my head, unable to speak. I didn't recognize the man, and the way he was just standing there, silently watching us, sent a wave of fear through me. Suddenly, the man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. That was all it took. Without saying a word, the three of us bolted from our hiding spot, running as fast as we could back toward the bonfire. Branches whipped at our faces, and the cold air stung our lungs. But we didn't stop. When we burst into the clearing, we found the rest of our friends sitting around the fire, laughing and chatting. They looked up, startled, as we came crashing through the underbrush. "The game's over," Jake shouted, his voice shaking. "We need to go inside, now." Everyone fell silent, the mood shifting instantly. "What happened?" someone asked, but we were too shaken to explain. We quickly gathered around the fire, glancing nervously back toward the woods. We didn't see the man again, but the thought of him being out there lurking in the darkness was enough to end the game and the night. We packed up our things and headed inside Jake's house, locking the doors behind us. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too scared to go back outside. I'm Matt, and this happened last fall during a bonfire with my friends. We were all seniors in high school, enjoying one of the last warm nights before the weather turned cold. The bonfire was at Ryan's house, deep in the woods behind his place, where we'd all gathered to roast marshmallows, tell stories, and just hang out. There were about 8 of us that night. Me, Ryan, my best friend Tom, and a few others, including Jane, the girl I'd had a crush on since freshman year. We'd been friends for a long time, but I'd never worked up the nerve to tell her how I felt. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to truth or dare. It was a stupid game, something we hadn't played since middle school, but the atmosphere was perfect for it. Dark, a little eerie, and with the fire crackling between us. At first, the dares were harmless. Eat 5 marshmallows at once, do a ridiculous dance, or hold your hand close to the fire for a few seconds. We all laughed as we completed the dares, trying to outdo each other with more absurd challenges. Then it was Tom's turn. He smirked at me, a glint in his eye that made me nervous. "Matt, I dare you to go into the woods with Jane, alone." The group fell silent, the crackling of the fire suddenly louder in the stillness. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Jane, who looked just as surprised as I was. This wasn't the kind of dare we'd been doing, and Tom knew exactly what he was doing. I felt my face flush, but I wasn't about to back down. "All right," I said, trying to sound casual. "Come on, Jane." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, giving me a small smile. We stood up and grabbed a flashlight from Ryan, who handed it to us with a teasing grin. The rest of the group watched as we walked away from the fire, the light of the flames growing dimmer behind us. We walked in silence for a while, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The woods were dense, and the path quickly became difficult to follow. The further we went, the more nervous I became, not just because of the dare, but because I knew I wanted to tell Jane how I felt. "Matt, this is kind of spooky," Jane said, her voice low. "Yeah, but we'll be fine," I replied, trying to reassure her and myself. As we walked, I tried to work up the courage to say something, anything, about how I felt. But every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck in my throat. I could feel the tension between us, and I knew she could too. We walked a little further, and just as I was about to speak, Jane stopped abruptly. "Matt, look." I followed the beam of the flashlight to where she was pointing. My heart dropped into my stomach. There, in the middle of the path, was a black trash bag. It was large, tightly wrapped with duct tape, and it looked out of place, completely unnatural. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's just trash?" Jane asked, though we both knew it wasn't. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. The bag was lumpy, misshapen, as if something irregular was inside it. I wanted to turn around and go back to the fire, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Jane stayed back, her hand gripping my arm. "Matt, maybe we should go back." But I was already moving forward, the curiosity and fear battling inside me. The closer I got, the more I could see the crude way the duct tape was wrapped around the bag, as if someone had hastily tried to seal something inside. Just as I was about to take another step, I heard a rustling sound from the woods behind us. Jane and I both froze, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. I turned slowly, shining the light toward the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows, standing just a few feet away from us. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Jane gasped, her grip on my arm tightening. "Matt, we need to go, now." Without a word, I grabbed her hand, and we turned and ran back toward the bonfire. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as we sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear Jane's breath coming in short gasps, matching my own. When we finally burst into the clearing, the others looked up, startled. They saw the fear on our faces and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Tom asked, his earlier smirk replaced by concern. "We found something," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "In the woods, a bag, and someone else was there." Ryan stood up, looking between us. "What do you mean, someone else?" "A man," Jane said, her voice trembling. "He was just standing there, watching us." The group fell silent, the light from the bonfire casting eerie shadows on their faces. No one laughed or made a joke this time. We all knew that whatever was out there, it wasn't something we wanted to mess with. After a few moments of tense silence, Ryan grabbed a couple of flashlights. "We should go back and check it out," he said, his voice steady but his eyes showing a hint of fear. Reluctantly, the group followed him back into the woods, sticking close together. When we reached the spot where Jane and I had seen the bag, we found nothing but a few scraps of black plastic scattered on the ground. The bag was gone, and so was the man. We searched the area, our nerves on edge, but there was no sign of either. The only thing left was the unsettling feeling that we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. We hurried back to the bonfire, our earlier excitement completely gone. The night had taken a dark turn, and none of us wanted to be out in the woods any longer. We quickly packed up our things and headed back to Ryan's house, sticking close together the whole way. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We didn't go back into the woods, and no one suggested playing another game. The thrill of the dare had been replaced by a gnawing fear, one that stayed with me long after the fire had burned out. That night, I realized that some dares aren't worth taking, and sometimes the things you find when you step into the darkness are better left alone. I'm Sarah, and this story happened during my sophomore year of high school. I had just transferred to a new school and was struggling to fit in. Being the new girl is never easy, and I found myself constantly on the outside, trying to break into the established cliques. That's when I met a group of girls who seemed to take an interest in me. There was Jessica, Amanda, and Brooke. They invited me to hang out a few times, and I was thrilled to finally be included. So when they invited me to a bonfire at Jessica's house one Friday night, I jumped at the chance. Jessica's family owned a large property on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, the perfect place for a bonfire. When I arrived, the fire was already roaring, and the girls were laughing and chatting as they roasted marshmallows. It seemed like a fun, laid-back night, and I felt a sense of relief that I was finally being accepted. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to local ghost stories and dares. Jessica, with a mischievous grin, suggested we play a game. "How about we do something really scary?" she said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Let's play hide and seek in the woods." I hesitated. The woods were pitch dark, and the idea of wandering around in them didn't exactly thrill me. But the girls were all for it, and I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. So I agreed. Jessica handed me a flashlight and smirked. "You're the new girl, so you hide first. We'll count to 100, and then we'll come find you." I nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I turned on the flashlight and walked into the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The sound of their laughter faded as I moved deeper into the trees, the firelight barely visible behind me. I found a spot behind a large tree and crouched down, trying to calm my nerves. The woods were eerily quiet, and I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven in the stillness. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, expecting to hear the girls calling out for me any moment. But the minutes ticked by, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe they were trying to scare me, waiting until I got really freaked out before they jumped out at me. I stood up, shining the flashlight around, but the woods were empty. "Jessica, Amanda, Brooke," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I started walking back toward the fire, my heart pounding. The farther I walked, the more I realized something was wrong. I should have reached the clearing by now, but all I could see were more trees. The firelight was nowhere in sight. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now I had no idea how to get back. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods looked the same in every direction. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Relief washed over me as I quickened my pace, hoping to see the comforting sight of the bonfire and the girls waiting for me. But when I reached the clearing, my relief turned to dread. The bonfire was completely extinguished, just a pile of cold ashes and charred wood. The girls were nowhere to be found. The laughter, the warmth, the light, it was all gone. I called out their names again, my voice echoing in the eerie silence. Nothing. I felt my pockets for my phone, but it was gone. My purse was missing too. My heart sank as I realized they must have taken them when I wasn't looking. I was alone, in the dark, without any way to contact anyone. The reality of the situation hit me hard, and I felt a wave of fear and anger. They had done this on purpose. This was all just a cruel joke. With no other choice, I started walking back toward Jessica's house. The path was long, and every sound made me jump. The woods that had seemed so full of life earlier now felt oppressive and dangerous. When I finally reached the house, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I opened the front door, expecting to find the girls worried about me, or at least feeling guilty. But what I found was far worse. They were all sitting in the living room, laughing and chatting, like nothing had happened. When they saw me, they burst into hysterical laughter. "Oh my God, Sarah, you should have seen your face," Jessica cackled, tears of laughter streaming down her cheeks. "We were watching the whole time," Amanda added, holding up my phone. "You were so freaked out." Brooke, who had always been the quiet one, finally spoke up, a smirk on her face. "It was just a joke, Sarah. Lighten up." I stood there, stunned, my anger and embarrassment mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. They had planned this all along, to lure me out into the woods, steal my things, and leave me to wander around scared out of my mind. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked out of the house, ignoring their calls for me to come back. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing how much they had hurt me. That night, I learned a hard lesson. Not everyone who smiles at you is a friend, and some people will go out of their way to make you feel small, just to make themselves feel bigger. It was a cruel prank, and it left me questioning who I could trust. But more than that, it made me stronger. I knew I didn't need people like them in my life. The next day, I deleted their numbers from my phone, and I never looked back. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you can be reminded when we post a new video every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email it to us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story featured in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.